History of the Peloponnesian War, by Thucydides. Introduction. Imagine this. It's the height of summer in the year 415 BC. You're standing at the port of Athens, Pericles, and the air is electric. The entire city has poured out to the docks, a sea of faces filled with a strange mix of hope and tears. Before you lies the most magnificent fleet ever launched by a single Greek city. 134 triremes, their bronze rams gleaming in the morning sun, their sails bright against the blue Aegean. Thousands of soldiers, the flower of Athenian youth, decked out in polished armor, stand on the decks. This is more than an army. It is a spectacle. A display of wealth, power, and ambition so overwhelming it feels like a force of nature. A trumpet calls for silence. A herald's voice rises, and the entire armada, together with the crowds on shore, offers prayers to the gods. Goblets of gold and silver are raised, libations are poured, and a great hymn is sung to the heavens. Then, as the oars begin to move, the ships sail out, first in a proud column, and then, as if unable to contain their energy, they break into a race, speeding towards the horizon. Their destination? Sicily. An island far away, filled with rumored riches and cities to be conquered. The soldiers are full of dreams of glory. The people on shore weep for the sons they may never see again, but even their grief is tinged with pride. They are Athenians. They believe nothing is impossible. And yet, this glorious morning is the beginning of the end. This fleet, this army, this embodiment of Athenian power, will never return. Almost every man will perish, thousands of miles from home, in a disaster so complete, so utterly devastating, that it will break the back of their empire and echo through all of history. The man who tells us this story was not just a historian looking back. He was an Athenian general named Thucydides. He lived through it all. He fought in the war, he suffered exile because of it, and he dedicated his life to understanding one single, terrifying question: how could a people so brilliant, so powerful, so confident, bring about their own destruction? His book, The History of the Peloponnesian War, has been studied for over 2,000 years, not by academics in ivory towers, but by generals, presidents, and leaders trying to navigate the treacherous currents of power. Why? Because Thucydides did something no one had ever done before. He looked past the myths, the gods, and the propaganda, and he saw that the story of war is the story of human nature. It's a story about fear, pride, and ambition. It's about how rational people make disastrous decisions, and how empires rise only to crumble under the weight of their own success. Today, we're going to walk through that story. And I promise you, by the end of our time together, you will understand that this isn't just about ancient Greece. It's about the world we live in right now. It is a timeless lesson on power, conflict, and the enduring, unchanging, and often tragic nature of humanity itself. Book summary. Our story begins in a world dominated by two superpowers, each the polar opposite of the other. On one side, you have Sparta, a nation of warriors, living a rigid, disciplined, austere life on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. The Spartans are unmatched on land. Their society is a military machine, built on tradition, obedience, and a deep suspicion of anything new. They are the leaders of the Peloponnesian League, a coalition of land-based, oligarchic states that look to Sparta for protection and leadership. And on the other side, you have Athens, a city buzzing with energy, art, and radical new ideas. Athens is a democracy, a sea power, a commercial hub. Its people are curious, innovative, daring, and often reckless. After the Great War against the Persian Empire, Athens created its own alliance, the Delian League. It began as a voluntary union to protect against Persia, but over time, Athens transformed it into an empire of its own, demanding tribute and punishing any who tried to leave. For decades, these two powers coexisted in a tense Cold War. But as Athens grew richer and more powerful, a deep anxiety began to spread through Sparta and its allies. Thucydides puts his finger on the single, most important cause of the war, and it's a lesson that has been studied ever since. He writes that the real cause was the growth of the power of Athens, and the alarm which this inspired in Lacedaemon. Sparta feared that Athens's rising power would eventually leave no room for its own. This is the heart of what we now call the Thucydides trap, the dangerous dynamic that occurs when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling one. The war didn't start with a grand declaration. It started, as great wars often do, with a conflict in a small, seemingly unimportant corner of the world. A civil war broke out in a city called Epidamnus. This led to a fight between two of the secondary powers, Corinth, a key Spartan ally, and Corcyra, a naval power with ties to Athens. Each side appealed to the great powers. Corinth begged Sparta to rein in the Athenians, who were meddling in their affairs. Corcyra, in a desperate plea, went to Athens and offered them their powerful navy in exchange for protection. The debate in Athens was intense. To accept Corcyra's offer meant a direct confrontation with Sparta's ally, Corinth, and would almost certainly lead to war. To refuse meant allowing Corcyra's navy to fall into the hands of their enemies. In the end, Athens chose what it saw as its own interest. They made a defensive alliance with Corcyra. It was a half measure, designed to avoid provoking Corinth directly, but it failed. A naval battle erupted, and Athenian ships were drawn into the fighting. The line had been crossed. The Corinthians were outraged. They went to Sparta and, in a great congress of the Peloponnesian allies, made their case for war. They painted a vivid picture of their rivals. The Athenians, they said, were born into the world to take no rest themselves and to give none to others. They are innovators, quick to act, daring beyond their power, and never satisfied. You Spartans, on the other hand, are slow, cautious, and always hesitant. If you don't stop them now, they will consume you all. After much debate, Sparta sent an ultimatum to Athens. Their demands were many, but the final one was simple: leave the Hellenes independent. For Athens, this was an impossible demand. It meant giving up their empire, the very source of their power and wealth. In Athens, the great statesman Pericles stood before the assembly. He was the city's leading voice, a man of immense wisdom and foresight. He urged them not to give in. He laid out a clear-eyed strategy for the coming war. The Spartans, he argued, were a land power. Let them invade Attica, our countryside. They can burn our farms, but they cannot touch the true source of our strength. We will abandon the countryside, bring our people inside the long walls connecting the city to its port, and turn Athens into an island. From this fortress, our navy will rule the sea, strangling their trade and raiding their coasts. We will not seek to expand our empire during this war, but we will defend what we have. It will be a war of attrition. We have more money, we have a superior navy, and we have the defensive advantage. If we are patient and united, we cannot lose. Persuaded by his logic, the Athenians rejected the Spartan ultimatum. The war was on. Just as Pericles predicted, the Spartan army, the most formidable land force in Greece, invaded Attica. The Athenians watched from their walls as the smoke rose from their farms and ancestral homes. The city was crowded, tense, and angry. Many clamored for Pericles to lead them out to fight, to defend their land. But he held firm. He knew a pitched battle against the Spartan phalanx was suicide. Their strength was at sea. But then, something happened that no one, not even the wise Pericles, could have foreseen. In the second year of the war, a plague broke out in the overcrowded city. It was a terrifying disease. Thucydides, who caught it himself and survived, describes the symptoms in horrifying detail: violent heats in the head, inflammation of the eyes, throats becoming bloody, unnatural breath, violent coughing, and unbearable thirst. The physicians were helpless. They died faster than anyone as they tended to the sick. The plague did more than kill, it shattered the very soul of Athens. Thucydides tells us that law and religion lost all meaning. Fear of gods or law of man, there was none to restrain them, he writes. People saw the virtuous and the wicked dying alike, and they concluded that piety and honor were pointless. They spent their money on fleeting pleasures, believing their lives and riches were things of a day. The social fabric, the respect for tradition, the very order that made Athens great, began to unravel in the face of death. Pericles himself lost his 2 sons to the plague. Yet, he stood before the demoralized people one last time. He did not offer empty comfort. He reminded them of their greatness, of the empire they had built, and of their duty to preserve it. He told them that while their private sufferings were immense, the fate of the city was paramount. He urged them to bear their afflictions with courage. Not long after, Pericles too succumbed to the sickness. With him died the steady hand that had guided Athens. The war, however, ground on. After Pericles, new leaders emerged in Athens, men who were more aggressive, more brutal, and more in tune with the city's frayed nerves. The most prominent was Cleon, a man Thucydides describes as the most violent man at Athens. A dramatic episode unfolded at the city of Mytilene, on the island of Lesbos. Mytilene was one of Athens' most important allies, and it had revolted. An Athenian army was sent and, after a long siege, the Mytileneans surrendered. The Athenian assembly, in a fit of rage, and spurred on by Cleon, voted to put all the adult men of Mytilene to death and to enslave the women and children. A ship was sent to carry out the brutal decree. But overnight, a change of heart swept through Athens. The people were horrified by the cruelty of their own decision. A second assembly was hastily called. Cleon again rose to speak, arguing fiercely that mercy was weakness. An empire, he said, cannot be run on sentiment. Your empire is a despotism, he reminded them, and your subjects are disaffected conspirators, whose obedience is ensured not by your suicidal concessions, but by the superiority given you by your own strength. He was answered by a man named Diodotus, who argued not for mercy, but for self-interest. He pointed out that such a brutal punishment would make every future city that contemplated revolt fight to the absolute bitter end, knowing that surrender meant death. It would make sieges longer, costlier, and would leave Athens with nothing but ruined cities. A moderate punishment, on the other hand, would encourage cities to surrender quickly when they knew their cause was lost. The debate was fierce, but in the end, Diodotus's argument narrowly won. A second ship was immediately dispatched. The crew rowed with all their might, eating their meals of barley cakes mixed with oil and wine at their oars, sleeping only in turns. The first ship, carrying the death sentence, was in no hurry. The second ship arrived just as the Athenian commander was about to carry out the original order, saving the people of Mytilene from massacre. The incident revealed the deep cracks in the Athenian psyche, torn between the brutal necessities of empire and their own ideals. The war had its ebbs and flows. The Athenians captured a contingent of elite Spartan soldiers at a place called Pylos, a huge blow to Sparta's prestige. In response, the Spartans sent their most brilliant general, Brasidas, on a daring campaign through northern Greece. Brasidas was the opposite of the typical Spartan. He was charismatic, eloquent, and a master of diplomacy. He marched through Thrace, not just conquering, but persuading Athenian allies to revolt by offering them freedom. He captured the vital city of Amphipolis, a major blow to Athens and a personal humiliation for the historian Thucydides, who was the general in command of that region and was exiled for his failure to save the city. Finally, in a battle outside Amphipolis, the two leading warhawks of each side, the Athenian Cleon and the Spartan Brasidas, were both killed. Their deaths removed the two greatest obstacles to peace. The two sides, exhausted by 10 years of fighting, were ready to talk. The result was the Peace of Nicias, a truce meant to last for 50 years. But it was a fragile peace, built on a foundation of mistrust and unresolved issues. Neither side fully complied with the terms. Key allies of Sparta, like Corinth and Thebes, refused to sign it. The old tensions simmered just beneath the surface. And into this fragile peace stepped the most dazzling, ambitious, and dangerous figure of the entire war, Alcibiades. Alcibiades was young, handsome, fabulously wealthy, and descended from one of Athens' most noble families. He was a brilliant speaker, a gifted military strategist, and utterly without scruple. He saw the peace as an obstacle to his own ambition and set about undermining it. He forged a new, provocative alliance with Argos, Sparta's old rival in the Peloponnese, and drew Athens back into the conflicts of the mainland. This unstable period culminated in one of the most chilling episodes in the entire book, the Melian Dialogue. Melos was a tiny island, a colony of Sparta, that had remained neutral in the war. Athens decided it could no longer tolerate this neutrality. They sent an armada to the island and, before attacking, sent envoys to negotiate. Thucydides presents the dialogue that followed. The Melians appeal to justice, to honor, to the gods, and to the hope that Sparta will come to their aid. The Athenians brush all this aside. They are brutally, shockingly honest. They tell the Melians that this isn't a debate about right and wrong. Right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, they say, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. They lay out the cold logic of empire. Your friendship, they explain, would be a sign of our weakness to our other subjects. Your destruction will be a sign of our power. Hope is a comfort for the desperate, but you are not in a position to indulge in it. The gods? We believe the gods, like men, rule wherever they can. The Spartans? They will not risk their own safety for yours. Expediency and security are their guides, not honor. The Melians refuse to submit. They will not, they say, in a moment deprive of freedom a city that has been inhabited for 700 years. The Athenians respond with a chillingly calm prediction: you have staked most on, and trusted most in, the Lacedaemonians, your fortune, and your hopes, and so will you be most completely deceived. The Athenians lay siege to the city. The Melians, abandoned by the gods and the Spartans, are eventually forced to surrender. The Athenians put to death all the grown men they took, sold the women and children for slaves, and sent out 500 colonists to inhabit the place themselves. It is in this climate of ruthless ambition, with Athens at the peak of its power and arrogance, that the fateful decision is made. Envoys arrived from the city of Egesta in Sicily, begging for help in their local war against their neighbor, Selinus, who was being backed by the most powerful city in Sicily, Syracuse. The Egestians promised vast wealth to finance the war. The Athenian assembly convened. The cautious general Nicias, a respected and experienced statesman, argued passionately against the expedition. He reminded them of the enemies they still had at home, the instability of their empire, and the immense risks of opening a new war so far away. Sicily, he warned, was a huge and populous island. To conquer it would be a monumental task, and to fail would be catastrophic. But he was opposed by Alcibiades. In a speech brimming with youthful confidence and ambition, Alcibiades painted a picture of a glorious adventure. Sicily, he claimed, was full of disunited cities and motley rabbles, ripe for the taking. Conquering it would bring Athens immense wealth and power, cementing their empire forever. Do not be afraid, he told them. Let us show the Peloponnesians how little we care for this peace, and let us win a new empire abroad." The assembly was captivated. The older men thought they could not lose with such a large force. The young men were filled with a longing for foreign sights and adventure. The common people dreamed of the pay and plunder to be gained. Nicias, seeing that he could not dissuade them, tried one last tactic. He decided to scare them with the sheer scale of the undertaking. He came forward again and said that if they were to go, they must go with an overwhelming force, at least 100 galleys, more than 5,000 heavy infantry, archers, slingers, and a vast supply train. He hoped the enormous cost would make them reconsider. But it had the opposite effect. The Athenians, in their state of supreme confidence, saw the massive force not as a burden, but as a guarantee of success. They voted for everything Nicias asked for, and more. They fell, as Thucydides says, in love with the enterprise. And so the great fleet set sail on that summer morning, the grandest expression of Athenian power, sailing toward its doom. The expedition began badly. When they arrived in Sicily, they discovered the Egestians had tricked them. The vast wealth they had promised was a phantom. They had borrowed gold and silver cups from neighboring cities and passed them off as their own to deceive the Athenian envoys. The generals were divided on what to do. Nicias, ever cautious, wanted to make a show of force and then go home. Alcibiades wanted to build alliances and then attack. But before any plan could be decided upon, a ship arrived from Athens. It came with orders for Alcibiades to return home to stand trial. While the expedition was preparing, a bizarre act of sacrilege had occurred in Athens. In one night, the faces of the Hermi, stone pillars with the head of the god Hermes, which stood at doorways all over the city, had been mutilated. The city was thrown into a panic, seeing it as a terrible omen and a sign of a conspiracy to overthrow the democracy. Alcibiades, with his scandalous lifestyle and powerful enemies, was the prime suspect. Knowing that a trial in the current climate of hysteria would mean a death sentence, Alcibiades made a fateful choice. He agreed to follow the ship back, but at the first opportunity, he escaped, made his way to Peloponnese, and offered his services to the one city that could do Athens the most harm, Sparta. It was the ultimate betrayal. Alcibiades, the man who had championed the expedition, now stood before the Spartan assembly and laid bare all of Athens' plans and weaknesses. He told them exactly what they needed to do to win the war. First, he said, you must send a Spartan general to Syracuse. A real commander will organize their resistance and give them the spine they need. Second, and more importantly, you must do what we Athenians have always feared most. You must establish a permanent fort in Attica itself, at a place called disastrous. This will deny Athens the use of their countryside year-round, cut them off from their silver mines, and slowly bleed them to death. The Spartans listened, and they acted on his advice. In Sicily, with Alcibiades gone, the command fell to the reluctant Nicias. After some initial successes, the Athenian army laid siege to Syracuse. They began building a massive wall of circumvallation, a double wall that would stretch for miles, aiming to seal off the city from the land and the sea. The Syracusans were on the brink of despair. But just as the wall was nearing completion, the Spartan general Gylippus arrived. He slipped through the Athenian lines with a small force, but his arrival was electrifying. He was the embodiment of Spartan leadership. He organized the Syracusan army, stopped the completion of the Athenian wall by building a counterwall, and began to turn the tide. The besiegers had become the besieged. Nicias, seeing the situation deteriorating, wrote a desperate letter back to Athens. He described the rotting of their ships, the sickness in the camp, the desertion of their mercenary crews, and the growing strength of the enemy. He begged them either to recall the army or to send another one just as large to save it. The Athenians, refusing to accept the possibility of failure, chose the latter. They equipped a new fleet and a new army under the command of their best remaining general, Demosthenes. When Demosthenes arrived at Syracuse, he found the first army in a desperate state. He knew that their only chance was a bold, decisive stroke. He devised a daring plan, a night attack to capture the high ground of Epipolae, the strategic key to Syracuse. The attack began with success. The Athenians stormed the heights in the darkness, taking the enemy by surprise. But in the confusion of the night battle, with the bright moon casting deceptive shadows, chaos took hold. The Athenians, pushed back by a contingent of Boeotians, fell into disorder. Friends fought friends. The watchword was passed to the enemy. The paean, the Greek war hymn, sung by Dorian allies in the Athenian army, was mistaken for that of the enemy, causing panic. The retreat turned into a rout, with men tumbling down the cliffs in the darkness. The attack was a catastrophic failure. Demosthenes now knew the expedition was doomed. He urged Nicias to abandon the siege immediately and sail away while their navy was still superior. But Nicias, ever hesitant and superstitious, refused. He still had secret contacts within the city promising betrayal, and he was terrified of facing the Athenian assembly after such a failure. Then, as they were finally preparing to leave, a lunar eclipse occurred. Nicias, who was deeply superstitious, took it as a terrible omen and refused to depart until they had waited the prescribed thrice 9 days. That delay was fatal. The Syracusans, now supremely confident, used the time to block the mouth of the great harbor, trapping the entire Athenian fleet. The Athenians' only hope was to fight their way out. They manned every ship they had, about 110 in all, and charged the barrier. What followed was the final, climactic battle. Thucydides describes the scene from the shore, where the entire Athenian army stood watching, their lives hanging on the outcome. It was a brutal, chaotic melee in the confined space of the harbor. The air was filled with the crashing of ships, the shouting of commands, and the screams of the dying. The Athenian soldiers on the shore swayed with the fortunes of the battle, crying out in agony at every loss, and cheering in desperate hope at every small success. In that one Athenian army, Thucydides writes, there was every sound to be heard at once, shrieks, cheers, we win, we lose, and all the other manifold exclamations that a great host would necessarily utter in great peril. But the Syracusans, with their reinforced prows and fighting in their home waters, were unstoppable. The Athenian fleet was utterly defeated, broken, and driven ashore. Panic seized the army. Their last hope was gone. Now came the final, horrifying chapter: the retreat by land. 40,000 men began a desperate march through hostile territory, hoping to reach some friendly city. They were without food, without hope, and haunted by the sight of their sick and wounded comrades whom they were forced to leave behind. The Syracusan cavalry and light troops harassed them every step of the way. The march was a week-long agony of hunger, thirst, and constant attack. The division of Demosthenes, lagging behind, was surrounded and forced to surrender. Nicias's division pushed on, until they reached the river Acinarus. Maddened by thirst, the men broke ranks and rushed into the water, each wanting to be the first to drink. The Syracusans lined the steep banks above and showered them with missiles. The Peloponnesians came down into the riverbed and butchered them as they drank. The water, Thucydides tells us, was immediately spoiled, but which they went on drinking just the same, mud and all, bloody as it was, most even fighting to have it. At last, with his army being slaughtered around him, Nicias surrendered. Of the 40,000 who began the retreat, few escaped. The prisoners, numbering at least 7,000, were herded into the stone quarries of Syracuse. There, exposed to the burning sun by day and the cold autumn nights, with barely enough food and water to survive, They died in droves from wounds, sickness, and exposure. Nicias and Demosthenes were executed. It was, Thucydides concludes, the greatest Hellenic achievement of any in this war, or, in my opinion, in Hellenic history, at once most glorious to the victors, and most calamitous to the conquered. They were beaten at all points and altogether. Their fleet, their army, everything was destroyed, and few out of many returned home. When the news reached Athens, no one at first would believe it. When the conviction was finally forced upon them, the city was seized by a panic unlike any before. They had lost their army, their navy, and the flower of their youth. Their allies began to revolt, emboldened by the disaster. The Persians, seeing their weakness, now entered the war, providing money to the Spartans to build a new fleet. Alcibiades, ever the opportunist, switched sides again, abandoning the Spartans to work for the Persian satrap Tissaphernes, all the while plotting his return to Athens. In the city, the shock of the disaster led to a political coup. The democracy was overthrown and replaced by an oligarchy, the rule of the 400. But the Athenian fleet, based at the island of Samos, refused to accept the new government. Led by men like Thrasybulus, they declared themselves the true democratic government of Athens, and, in a strange twist of fate, recalled Alcibiades to be their general. The war entered its final grinding phase. Athens, fighting with a desperation born of survival, managed to hold on for another 9 years. They won some surprising victories at sea, but their resources were drained, their empire was crumbling, and the Spartan army was permanently camped at Disastrous, choking the life out of Attica. The end finally came not in a great battle, but through exhaustion and one last, fatal mistake. The Athenian fleet was caught unprepared on a beach at a place called Aegospotami and destroyed. Without its navy, Athens could no longer import food. Starved into submission, the city surrendered. The long walls, the symbol of their power, were torn down to the music of flutes. The great Peloponnesian War was over. Commentary. So why, after more than 2 millennia, do we still read this story of a long-forgotten war? Why does the name Thucydides still command such respect? It is because he gave us more than just a record of events. He gave us a profound and timeless meditation on power, war, and human nature. He wanted his book to be not just a story to be enjoyed for a moment, but a possession for all time, and in that, he succeeded beyond measure. The first great lesson of this work is its unflinching realism about what drives human affairs. Thucydides saw that nations and people are moved by a powerful triad of motives: fear, honor, and interest. He brushed aside the noble speeches and the religious justifications to show that, beneath it all, the pursuit of power and security is the engine of history. The Melian dialogue is the most brutal expression of this, but the theme runs through the entire book. It's a sobering thought, but it's a critical one for understanding the world. When you watch nations compete today, when you hear leaders give their reasons for their actions, Thucydides teaches you to look deeper, to ask, what are their fears? What are their interests? The second great lesson is about the psychology of power itself, and the danger of hubris. The story of Athens is a tragedy of overconfidence. Their success against Persia and their subsequent rise to empire convinced them that they were exceptional, that the normal rules did not apply to them. This belief led them to the disastrous Sicilian Expedition. They fell in love with a glorious idea and refused to listen to the cautious voice of reason. They confused their hopes with a sound assessment of their capabilities. It's a warning that echoes down to our own time, a reminder that success can be more dangerous than failure, because it can blind us to our own limitations. Finally, Thucydides' history is a profound study of democracy and leadership in times of crisis. He shows us the strength of a democracy like Athens, its energy, its creativity, its ability to bounce back from adversity. But he also shows us its fatal weaknesses, its vulnerability to smooth-talking demagogues, its tendency to make passionate, short-sighted decisions, and its cruel treatment of its best leaders. We see the contrast between the wise, steady leadership of Pericles, who could guide and even contradict the people, and the reckless ambition of men like Cleon and Alcibiades, who pandered to the crowd's worst instincts for their own glory. It's a powerful reminder that a democracy is only as strong and as wise as its citizens and the leaders they choose to follow. So what can we take from this today? First, we can learn to be more astute observers of the world around us. When you see a conflict brewing, whether it's between nations or in your own community, think about the roles of fear, honor, and interest. Look for the underlying causes, not just the stated pretexts. Second, we can cultivate a healthy skepticism of overconfidence, both in our leaders and in ourselves. When a plan seems too good to be true, when it promises immense rewards with little risk, remember the Athenian fleet sailing for Sicily. The wisest course is often the one that acknowledges difficulties and prepares for them, not the one that ignores them in a fit of enthusiasm. And third, we can reflect on the responsibilities of being a citizen. Thucydides shows that words matter, that debates have consequences, and that the character of a nation is revealed in the choices it makes under pressure. That was the story told in the pages of History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. We've explored the main currents of this epic tale today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only skim the surface. The real power of this book is in the details, in the weight of the speeches, and in the profound, often somber, wisdom that Thucydides embeds in his narrative. This summary is meant to be a map to a hidden treasure. If anything we've talked about has sparked your curiosity or resonated with you, I truly encourage you to seek out a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history, it's an education in power, politics, and the unchanging patterns of human behavior that shape our world to this very day. A link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this journey into the past valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It lets me know that these stories matter, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration of another timeless book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep learning together.